The ancient mysteries of the world are some of the craziest and most exciting things to research ever. On today's list, we'll cover plagues, floods, shrunken heads, and much more, so let's jump in right now. First up on the iceberg, we have Cambyses' lost army. Now, Cambyses II was the son of Cyrus the Great, and he was the second emperor of the Achaemenid Empire that's of Persian origin. In the year 524 BC, Cambyses sent a troop of nearly 50,000 soldiers to take control of the Oracle of Ammon. Now, this Oracle of Ammon, you've probably never heard of it. I had never heard of it either. It was located at the Siwa Oasis in Egypt. See, Cambyses had been leading his Persian armies into Egypt to conquer the land, but it wasn't just conquering for the sake of conquering. To make a long story short, the Egyptian pharaoh at the time forced one of his own citizens, who was an eye doctor, to go live with Cambyses and the Persians because they wanted an eye doctor there in Persia where Cambyses was ruling. Now, Cambyses wasn't that serious. He wasn't like forcing this man to do this, but the pharaoh, he did. He forced his Egyptian citizen, who was an eye doctor, to go and live in Persia with Cambyses. Obviously, this Egyptian eye doctor did not take too well to this. He wasn't mad at the Persians, he was mad at the pharaoh because the pharaoh forced him to leave his family and go live off in Persia. So to stir up a little trouble, the eye doctor told Cambyses that he should ask the pharaoh for one of his daughters to marry, and so Cambyses does this. Now the pharaoh didn't want to send his own daughter after he, took that eye doctor away from his family, but anyway, as a stand-in for his own daughter, he sent the daughter of one of his political rivals that he had previously had executed. This daughter was forced to go marry Cambyses. Now obviously this daughter didn't like the way that the pharaoh just shipped her off to live with the emperor of Persia, so she told Cambyses that she is not the real daughter of Pharaoh. Now this made Cambyses extremely mad because the Pharaoh just completely lied and sent this girl who's not his daughter to marry him. So he launched the Persian invasion of Egypt to conquer it. Turnabout is indeed fair play. He defeated the pharaoh and then he started conquering all his land. Now to the topic at hand, the Oracle at Ammon was in the Siwa Oasis, like I said. He sent these 50,000 troops there across the desert and they just disappeared. Nobody ever saw them again. Historians say that they were probably swallowed and engulfed by a massive sandstorm, and honestly, this kind of tracks. In 2009, after all these years, some Italian archaeologists were doing some excavating out there near the Siwa Oasis, and they found stuff that dated back to the Achaemenid period. So it could have been a massive sandstorm that swallowed up this army, and that's why we never heard from them again. But I like the theory a little bit better that a dune sandworm just swallowed them. But, it was probably the natural causes. It was probably a sandstorm. Now let's look at the Etruscan civilization and its origins. The Etruscans were a group of people that lived in central Italy from the 8th century BC to the 3rd century BC. It eventually fell to Rome, but much of its culture was preserved in the Roman Republic and then Empire. The funny thing about the Etruscans is that we typically think of them as existing in that time period that I just told you about, but in all actuality, they existed a long time before that as the Villanovans back at like 1000 BC. These people were native to the Etruria region in Italy, and they thrived during the Iron Age. During this time period, the Etruscans spent a lot of time preparing their dead for the afterlife. A massive necropolis that held 193 tombs was found. Now these bodies were obviously cremated because the remains were found in ceramic and pesto urns that were common to this time period. Anyway, the Etruscans were apparently indigenous to this area of central Italy, and they remained there until they were absorbed by Rome. Well, absorbed is technically the right word, but they did fight several wars against Rome before they finally, took them over. Now, it's also been theorized that they're not indigenous to Italy, and they actually are some of the ancient Pelasgians that lived in the Greece area and migrated to the Italian area. We really don't know for a fact either way. At the end of the day, the Etruscans created their own thriving society and culture, so that's really all that matters. These people predated Rome, but obviously they didn't outlive it. They even had their own polytheistic religion that was very similar to the Greek and Roman systems. They had their own language, art styles, alphabet, and even an oligarchic republic to rule them. They even teamed up with Carthage in a naval battle to beat Rome over some trade routes and stuff like that. The Etruscans honestly deserve their own video, so I'm not going to go too deep into the weeds here, but just know they were awesome. Next up on the iceberg, we have helicopter hieroglyphics. Now, these things are absolutely insane when you look at them for the first time. Now, obviously, these are ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs, like duh, but upon first look, they look like a helicopter, a stealth fighter, and a submarine. So if you look back to my ancient Egyptian alien theory, we can honestly say that they were here and they had their technology everywhere. That's why we have helicopter hieroglyphics and submarines, stealth fighters, all this depicted on walls, right? Well, not quite. In all actuality, these things are probably present because of a sad misunderstanding of the hieroglyphs themselves. Basically what happened is that the pharaoh Seti I had hieroglyphs carved in his temple of Abydos, which is a town that's just west of the Nile in Egypt. Now, his hieroglyphs that he originally had carved roughly translate to "He who repulses the 9 enemies of Egypt," and it looks like this. It's on screen. Later on, his direct successor Rameses II had his hieroglyphs covered up and his own carved into the wall there. His look like this and roughly translates to "He who protects Egypt and overthrows foreign countries." So, similar messages, different wording. Now, over time, the plaster stuff that covered Seti's hieroglyphics kind of just faded away, so the two carvings merged together, and that's why we see what we see. We don't actually see helicopters and submarines. There weren't actually aliens, probably. It was just a misunderstanding, and that saddens me. The Plague of Athens. This plague was some sort of infectious disease that killed from 75,000 to 100,000 Athenians in the year 430 BC. This plague was pretty sus because it happened on the second year of the Second Peloponnesian War, which makes me and many others believe that it might have been a viral attack against the Athenians. So if you're unfamiliar with the Peloponnesian Wars, this one in particular was a power struggle between Sparta and Athens, who were both Greek city-states at the time. This war literally lasted for 27 years until Persia stepped in support of Sparta for some reason. After that happened, obviously Sparta reigned supreme over the rest of the Greeks for a long time. Anyway, back to the plague. Athens was facing Sparta, right? And Sparta just had it like that. You know, they were goated. Everybody knows that Sparta was some of the greatest warriors ever. So what they did was they barricaded themselves inside the city walls of Athens. Obviously, Sparta laid outside and sieged them. It actually wasn't that bad for Athens because they had a major advantage, which was their port on the sea. They had a really good naval presence, whereas Sparta didn't have any. This port was called the Port of Piraeus, and they used it to bring in supplies and food as needed. Unfortunately for Athens, having that many people barricaded inside the city walls for that long a time with the awful sanitation conditions of the time, it was just a breeding ground for disease, and it led to this sickness. This plague hit the Athenian people 3 times in just 5 years, and it wiped out nearly 100,000 of the Athenians. So what exactly was the disease? Well, most people think it was either smallpox or typhoid fever or something like that, but obviously they didn't have the fancy technology and labs that we have nowadays to discuss and find all these things, so we really don't know. Whatever the disease was probably came through with the people that entered in the Port of Piraeus, the sick people, and just spread like wildfire because of the terrible sanitary conditions of the time. So one of the things that disproves the theory that it was a targeted viral attack is that it actually hit a bunch of other towns in the Mediterranean area around the same time, but it didn't completely ravage anybody like the Athenians because the Athenians were behind their own city walls in their terrible sanitary conditions. That's why it happened. Supposedly, the Spartans that were just outside the wall never caught the disease. They never had it at all, really. And that's a little bit sus to me. They could have sent it through the port, I guess. I really don't know. It could have been targeted. It could have not been. The Spartans were just like that, so you never know. In all actuality, this disease did run through ancient Egypt and Libya, so honestly, the Athenians just had tough luck. What in the world are shrunken heads? Shrunken heads are next up on this iceberg, and honestly, I had no idea what they were until I did this research, so let's talk about it. I want to talk about it, but I don't want to talk about it. To be honest, I wish I didn't know what they were. So what makes this thing popular in modern culture is that there were severely high bounties placed on individuals or groups of people in South America during like the 20th century. Obviously, not just the 20th century, before that too. All the Native American tribes and stuff like that. We're going to talk about it. Before the 20th century, there were groups in the Amazon rainforest, which spans from the north part of Peru to the eastern part of Ecuador. These people placed an emphasis on slaying their enemies, beheading them, and bringing their bodies and heads back to camp so they could shrink the head and acquire the soul of the one they killed. This was a process highly valued by the indigenous tribes of the area, which are the Shuar, Achuar, Huambisa, and Agurana peoples. I read that off my notes, and I can't even say it when I'm reading it, so I'm sorry. I'm not trying to offend anybody. To shrink the head, you must behead a person, remove the skin from the top of their head, sew the mouth shut, boil the entire skull, and dry it with sand and hot rocks while keeping the scalp formed with your hands. This is one of the most disturbing things I've ever read in my entire life. And I've read Baraska. Once they're shrunk, these things are called sansas, and they actually had several uses back in the day. First of all, these things were obviously used as trophies by the ones who did the slaying and the shrinking of the heads. They also had spiritual meanings. Like I said earlier, this helps them to collect the soul of the one that they killed, but it also helps them to ward off the vengeful Musak spirits. Later on in this culture, Westerners started to colonize this area, as Westerners do, and they started paying good money for these things, these shrunken heads. Well, the thing about this was they either paid in money or they traded one head for one firearm. That's what we need. Tribes with firearms whenever you're trying to colonize an area. That just sounds genius by the colonizers. Now, naturally, because the Westerners are incentivizing the killings because they're paying money or giving them guns, this increased the rate of the killings. It got horrible to the point where the Ecuadorian and Peruvian governments literally stopped it and outlawed the practice, which should have been done so long ago it's not even funny. This should never have been a legal thing. I guess you can't police these people when they live out in the rainforest, but it's crazy. It kind of reminds me of the scalping practice that happened in the American West and Mexico back in the day in the Wild West. Did that happen too? If you've read Blood Meridian by Cormac McCarthy, you know what I'm talking about. It's just awful. At least for the Shrunken Heads, you can say there was an art to it. There was literally artistic practices they went through to do this, but scalping, they just cut the scalp off and turned it in. Whatever. The Villa of the Mysteries. This is a very well preserved villa in Pompeii that was once covered by the eruption from Mount Vesuvius like the rest of Pompeii. It was excavated in 1909 and it's been a very popular tourist attraction ever since, but why is that? Well, it's full of beautiful and suspicious fresco paintings. It was once a winery and it's just gorgeous. Oh yeah, and it's one of the largest villas in all of Pompeii. The real attraction is these frescoes because they're so suspicious, like I said. Apparently they were associated with the cult of Dionysus, and if you don't know who Dionysus was, he was basically the Greek god of partying and wine. This makes a lot of sense because, like I said, this villa was a winery once upon a time, so Dionysus, winery, kind of intertwined there. Also, on a side note, the cult of Dionysus was into some really weird stuff. Like, they were into violent group activities, if you know what I'm saying. They sacrificed animals, and they also had like strangely hypnotic plays and performances that went on. It was really weird. Anyway, the floors and the walls of this place are decked out with these frescoes. Like, every wall has like a panel that fits in a sequential story if you kind of analyze the frescoes. I'll tell you right now about this interpretation of the frescoes that I found on melbourneartclass.com. I'll leave a link in the description for that because I didn't come up with this. Obviously, I'm not an artist. I don't analyze this stuff. Well, I guess I do analyze stuff for a living, but not art. Anyway, in the first scene, a boy before a priestess reads off a scroll while the initiate, which is a woman, and she's obviously being initiated into the cult of Dionysus, she enters the room with a wreath and a tray of food. In the second scene, this priestess, an initiate, and an assistant read a basket while Silenus, who was a horseman or something from local lore, he's playing a lyre. The third scene shows the initiate in a dramatic pose like she's establishing a connection with the cult or something, and then the next couple scenes show that initiate disappeared like she's gone to the underworld or something to do with the cult of Dionysus. They do some more weird stuff. Dionysus appears, the initiate comes back and gets whipped for some reason, and then they all party. Cults were weird, even back in the day. It's kind of crazy how that works. Why do so many mythologies have flood myths? Alright, so the Great Flood is literally a tale as old as time. Christianity presents the Great Flood as a cleansing act that cleansed the earth of all the sinners and all the corruption, everything but Noah and the animals he took on his ark, and his family obviously. But after that, it's a clean slate for the world. Noah brought his family and 2 of every animal onto the ark with him. They waited a year, and that was that. They started over. Now, I didn't actually know this because I'm not very cultured outside of Christianity, if you want me to be completely honest, but other religions and mythologies have this Great Flood rumor too. There are ancient Mesopotamian accounts of this, such as the Epic of Gilgamesh or the Akkadian Atrahasis or the Sumerian Great Flood as well. These all have similar implications that a hero survives the great cleansing of the world via flood. Surprisingly enough, the Hindu also have a version of this. Vishnu's avatar warns the first man of a great flood, and it comes and he survives. Zoroastrianism, which we talked about in the very first Iceberg video, also has its own version of this. Plato's Timaeus has a great flood story, and so do many of the North American native tribes. So why does everybody have one of these? Well, it's probably because a great flood happened. Flood myths that date all the way back to the last glacial period still survive to this day, and it's like almost confirmed that it happened. If you want to get scientific with it, there's an archaeologist that states that there could have been great oceanic asteroid impacts that caused great tsunamis all across the world, and all these different cultures remember these tsunamis as great floods. Also, most ancient civilizations were built in great floodplains due to the fertility of the soil. If your civilization is built in a floodplain, then it's likely that you're going to experience floods. So that kind of ties all that back together, that everybody's going to have a flood. As far as the religious implications of this, obviously these religions present the flood as a great cleansing of the world. As man grew violent and corrupt, God saw that Noah was virtuous and he deserved to live, him and his family both. So if he would do as God said and follow his specs to building the ark, he would survive. He would save the rest of humanity and they would continue on. This same question and story of morality was presented in other religions as well, so obviously that's why they all have these same stories. If there's a worldly myth that fits along with a religious concept, then they are all going to have similar concepts in their civilizations. Now, whether it actually happened or not, I think it did, but we don't really know how exactly it went down. But that explains the question that's posed by the iceberg. The Phaistos Disk. This is a fired clay disc that has inscriptions and symbols on it that were never deciphered. Like many other things on this list, it dates back to the ancient Minoans of Crete. It dates back to over 3,000 years ago, and it was found in the palace at Phaistos. It's only 6 inches in diameter, but it has 45 unique symbols and 241 total, I believe. Like most ancient scripts, it has some symbols that represent plants, animals, and tools and things of that nature, but there's some that are completely unintelligible to us. Listen to this. Some scholars argue that it was probably a precursor to the ancient Greek language because obviously the Minoan civilization went on to inspire the Mycenaean culture, but others argue that it could have been ancient Hittite or even Egyptian. They really don't know what's going on. There's great debate about whether or not it even originated from Crete because some people believe, based on the pottery style, that it was actually brought in and just left on the floor of the palace. It's another one of those things that we will never know for a fact. Ever-burning lamps were a phenomenon reported by many different authors across time and across the world in general. Plutarch was a Greek philosopher that lived in the 1st century AD. He wrote about an ever-burning lamp outside the temple of Jupiter Ammon in Egypt, and he said that it could not be put out by wind or rain. A lot of other temples were rumored to have ever-burning lamps like this, as was the Roman king Numa Pompilius. It was supposed to aid in his power or something like that. There were other accounts of these things, such as one burning over the city gates of Antioch that was said to have burned for over 500 years. And there was another one that was located inside of an Egyptian temple that Christians thought to be of the devil, because of course they did. I say they like I'm not a Christian as well. I just don't have strange beliefs like some Christians, I think. When I'm telling you that every single ancient civilization had at least one on record of these ever-burning lamps, I'm not lying. Emperor Constantine's father's tomb supposedly held one of these ever-burning lamps at one point in time. Even the Hindu have a story of one of these ever-burning lamps that had been burning in the Himalayas since the beginning of time. So, were these things real? Probably not. Fire needs fuel, heat, and oxygen to burn. No matter how you design a lamp, it's always going to run out of fuel unless it's being constantly fed fuel, like the eternal flame of JFK's grave in the Arlington National Cemetery. It's being constantly fed natural gas, and that's why it never goes out. But this eternal flame at JFK's grave has a spark mechanism that will relight it if it goes out. Some of these in the ancient times that they say weren't put out by wind or rain, I don't believe it. But some could have been actually there. If it would have been burning, it would have been put out by wind or rain. But if it was resparked, there you go. I'm yapping in this video. This is crazy. Basically, what I'm trying to say by beating around the bush like this, talking in circles, is that if there was one that occurred in nature, it would have had to been a spark outside of a deep pocket of natural gas. And that pocket of natural gas would have been slowly feeding it for all the time, but it would have still gone out by wind or rain unless it was resparked. And in nature, it's not going to be resparked like that. The only other explanation I have for this is alien technology. The Indus Script. This was an ancient script that belonged to the people of the Indus Valley civilization in the Bronze Age. Now, this civilization took part in what is now known as parts of India, Persia, and Afghanistan. They're also called the Harappan people because there was a great excavation at the site of Harappa that had a bunch of their stuff from their culture from way back when. Now, this script has been found on over 4,000 objects, and it contains a unique 400 characters. That's a large alphabet. Now, obviously, alphabet is not how these things used to work, but still, pictorials, anything. 400's a lot to be unique symbols. Now, these things are mostly pictorial in nature, so you think we could look at the pictures and kind of decipher what they are, but we're really not that lucky. So what exactly is stopping us from figuring this out, you may ask? Well, I'll tell you. We don't even know the spoken language of the Harappan people, so that right there is a major issue. So you remember how I said there were over 400 unique symbols in this script? Well, that's true, but just 67 of these characters make up over over 80% of the writing that was found on all the objects. In percentages, that's like if 4 letters of the alphabet, say A, B, C, or D, made up over 80% of all of our writing that some civilization way in the future found. That's a crazy percentage. That makes it virtually impossible to transcribe all of that. Also, the inscriptions are very short, with the average being only 5 characters in length, with the longest being 34. Obviously, no Rosetta Stone that we can transcribe all the symbols has been found yet, so we're kind of just up a creek without a paddle. Now I got some good news for you. January 16th, 2025, which is very, very recent to whenever I'm recording this video, a member of the Indian government announced a $1 million reward to anyone who could decipher this script. So basically, if you're good with code and languages and linguistics and everything like that, you could make yourself a chunk of change if you figured this out, and everybody in the world would thank you. Well, not everybody in the world, because not everybody in the world cares, but I would thank you. Speaking of thanking you, thank you for watching this video. If you haven't seen the previous parts of this, I'm linking them on screen right here. You need to go check them out right now. And until next time, peace.